Welcome along to the Huddle Breakdown. Enda here with you in the company of Jaco James and Alan Morrison. And at the end of last week's podcast, ahead of the Scottish Cup final, I said that by this time next week, we may not have a manager. We got to Tuesday, and Celtic no longer have a manager as Ange Postecoglou departs the club to join Tottenham Hotspur in the Premier League. The reaction has been mixed to this, James, as we probably expected. A lot of people angry at his use of Tommy Burns quotes at the weekend. A lot of people saying that he should have told them before the Scottish Cup. The usual crack going on Twitter, tit for tat. People aren't happy. People were never going to be happy. We all knew this day was coming. And I feel deep down that the reason that people are angry or annoyed has nothing really to do with the manner in which he left, more so than the fact that none of us wanted him to leave.
I think it was a very reasonable outpouring of emotion. And when we get emotional, we can say all kinds of nonsensical things. And I certainly include myself in that. So yeah, I think he's an incredibly talented individual, and part of those talents are playing the role when he goes into a football club. And I don't mean that in a cynical way. I think I think Brendan Rodgers was probably a little bit more tilted on the spectrum of towards cynicism. Um, so I think Ange, and again, this is just my read on him, is a relatively genuine guy. Um, but he was playing a role, and part of playing that role in modern football is, um, you know, part of playing an entertainment job. And so he played that role very well, and people bought in. And I think the part of the authenticity was his personal story, the personal narrative, all of which is true, obviously, and relatable. And so I think part of that ended up in an unreasonable projection and expectation from some supporters onto him. um, and I think some of that came crumbling down as a result of this. And that's disappointing, understandably, and um, can be quite emotional. But Alan and I have been talking about this for the last few weeks. Some of our pop psychiatry attempts in trying to read him. And I put this on Twitter. I mean, to me, ever since I saw his quote relative to Juranovic leaving, that kind of fit with his prior interviews that I'd watched and listened to about him being a extremely ambitious professional. Um, and that's basically what he said with Juranovic. It's like, this guy's 28. He's getting an opportunity to go play in a Big Five league that he's never had before. Hello, that's what Ange just did. So, um, yeah, so all of it's kind of understandable. I think people settle down, kind of like after what happened with, the Eddie Howe collapse, and then who the hell's this guy when Ange got announced, and a lot of people going back to purge their Twitter feeds with their initial response to Ange's hire, maybe. Um, so I think this will all kind of shake out. And I think over the duration of time, I think his role in what's happened the last 2 years will be, his history kind of settles, fall very favorably.
Well, as we'll discuss on this podcast, there are several names being thrown out for the job, one of which was Brendan Rodgers in the opening couple of days. And given the reaction to Brendan Rodgers and people potentially wanting him back, I think it's fair to say that once the dust settles on this, Ange will be welcomed back at Celtic at any point, whether that's as a supporter or, if things don't go too well, then in England, he might end up back in Scotland. Who knows? But I personally feel, Alan, that the last couple of years for me have been some of the most enjoyable, as a Celtic fan, as a supporter. I don't think I've ever felt as connected to the club or the players or the story or the narratives or the manager in which I have been. And maybe that's because we've been doing this podcast as well and I've been engrossed in it. But at the same time, I still think that he did come in, and one of the strongest things and one of the best things and one of the most important things to do as a football manager or anybody coming into a top level business even is to reconnect the people who are involved within the club with the club and what it's about and what they're trying to do and get everybody on board. And Ange really, really did that over the last couple of years. Be that whether people want to think that it was all fake now, that's fine, that's their prerogative. But the feelings that we've gotten from him and from his team over the last couple of years were not fake. And I don't think that we should be tossing them to the side because he's gone and taken another job, to be honest.
Well, now listen, I think I summed it up with, the classic sort of sad that it's over, but happy that it happened, right? We will look back on this and realize that we had a world-class talent as our manager, which doesn't happen very often, and certainly hasn't happened probably arguably since Jock Stein, as far as Celtic are concerned. So, it is sad. I think the sadness comes from the fact that I think certainly I can only speak for myself really, obviously, but felt that it was probably going to be at best a 3-year thing with Ange, and it's now 2 years. But this is the modern world. This is the digital age. Things move a little bit quicker. Um, it's clear that Ange has been angling after a next challenge for probably a few months' time. Let's be honest with ourselves. But having said all that, listen, this is modern football. We wouldn't have known about these things. We wouldn't have known that Martin O'Neill was lined up to go to Leeds United in 2003 at that time. And, in this digital age, that would have been known, and we would probably have informed some of our opinions on Martin O'Neill, for example. So knowing, in terms of the venal, horrendous business that is football, and I always hate the business, love the game, is this is a man, to my opinion, has conducted himself with the utmost integrity. The fact he's looking for his next position, to me, is perfectly natural for a world-class talented person who's 58 years old, doesn't know how many more years he's got in him to be looking for the next opportunity. He probably realizes, he's listen. At the end of the day, he stayed and he did his job. Right now, some people walk away like Rodgers did in the middle of the night. Some people, drift off and it all just falls to shit. He stayed and he did his job. He got the treble over the line, and he walked away with his head held high, as far as I'm concerned. He's got an opportunity which him and his family can't possibly turn down. I hope he gets the support and what have you in his new role that he deserves. I'm sure he'll be a success. But listen, all of those things can be true, but also this isn't necessarily this. There are silver linings here. There really are silver linings for us as Celtic fans. It does remain true that Ange has never won a trophy beyond his second year. It does remain true that the team looked like it was falling on its arse for a number of weeks. I'd set a quiz question. I mean, people on the comments, please pile in terms of when was the last 90-minute performance, right? And this is, me and James have been kind of gently prodding at this side, to be fair, I think for quite a few weeks now, is when was the last great performance that the team put in? I can't remember, actually. I thought maybe the 4-0 at home to Aberdeen was pretty good, but, maybe 3-0 win away at Hearts. But I'm really struggling to pin down what was the last 90-minute performance. Now, some of that might be to do with the squad have got a sense. I don't think Ange, as I've said before, is a difficult man to read. He may be that there have been signs within the building, within the squad, that actually he seems to be drifting a little bit here. But having said that, the board haven't picked up on it, and that's pretty embarrassing until it seems to have come as a shock to them in the last week, which is incredible, actually, if you think about it. Or it might be
Alan, who would be shocked that this
the
board is shocked about something?
it might be that the players are simply, how much Ange ball can one take, and how many double training sessions, how many training harder than you play can one group of players take? And I think there's a little bit of that in it. And I'm not trying to be smart after the event. These are all trends that are observable in the data.
Mm.
To come back to our raison d'etre here, these are all things that are there and have been there for some time. And I'm bringing these up now because I would have got slaughtered if I'd brought them up in any sort of hardball way over the last few weeks. But nevertheless, they are there. Marcelo Bielsa, who Postecoglou's style very much is similar to, is famous for basically wearing everybody out. I think Paul Brennan made a great point during the week, that likening him to Jose Mourinho, and Mourinho's a horrible, cynical, defensive coach. But what he has in common with Postecoglou is the relentless demands he places upon his staff and upon his players. Now, he might do it in a more positive, grown-up way than Mourinho, but the results are the same. It's at the end of 2 years, everybody's exhausted. They're
Mm.
mentally exhausted. They're physically exhausted, and I think we might have been seeing a little bit of that in some of the performances. He may have been in a moment of self-reflection, and I'm just reaching here to, I'll be honest with you, thinking, can I actually improve this team to perform at a European level? Because I honestly don't think he could. And I'm not being clever here. I've been kind of hinting at this for some time. Is that I've said this type of football doesn't scale to the Champions League level, and if he's not willing to compromise on his style, then maybe he doesn't think he can take it any further. Fair enough. But at the end of the day, he's a professional. He's 58 years old, and he's been given an unbelievable opportunity from a financial perspective and from a visibility and professional perspective to further his career. And I've no harm
Mm.
on him in taking that. He's left in the best way he possibly could, right at the end of a season when we've got the maximum amount of time to regroup, the maximum amount of time to recruit. And the pressure now, all the pressure now, isn't on Ange, it's on the board, our board. You proved to us that by hiring Ange, that wasn't a fucking fluke, because I believe it was. I believe it was a fluke that we fell upon Ange. You proved to us that you can come up with a coherent follow-up to what this man gave us for the last 2 years.
Yeah, and you mentioned Mourinho there. Another name I would throw in is Pep Guardiola. The guy who usually comes in to replace those names is Carlo Ancelotti, who has a very laid back approach. And Thomas Muller and some of the Bayern Munich players spoke about Pep Guardiola and just being so tired mentally after a couple of years. And you're not really seeing it as much with Manchester City because he has an unlimited budget to replace and replenish the squad and get rid of Cancelo and these players so that he can always keep them on their toes. But you see that with these managers who demand so much tactically and mentally and physically that the squad does end up being very tired and depleted by the end of it. So, I mean, that is potentially part of it. I do think you're correct in saying that the board probably fluked their way to Ange, and I probably would well believe that as well. So the next couple of weeks are going to be interesting. We'll touch on who it's going to be and who the names or early names are being thrown out in just one sec. But I mean, James, like when you think about all that's going on in the last couple of months, the signs were there potentially. You'd hope that the board were preparing themselves. By the signs of it, they weren't. They were just trying to get Ange over the line. Now they're fighting for their lives to keep John Kennedy, who Ange wants to take with him to Spurs. There is also the potential that Ange will take a player or two with him if he feels like they're going to bring something to the table at a Premier League level. But all of this leads to the question now is, yeah, what's this board going to do? Because the easy answer in the past was Peter Lawwell is holding the club back. This is now the opportunity for the quote unquote new board to stamp their authority and say, this is a different Celtic than it has been in the last number of years.
That's the real challenge here is to, without having any direct knowledge of the decision-making process that's gone on, we're left with kind of playing astrology and connecting the stars. And, I think given the history, the pattern of the history of decision-making, or at least the outcomes from that, and then some of the reporting early in Ange's tenure, and then the subsequent, and Alan's had better pipeline of information on this. I've had no visibility, so to speak, on it, which is, basically Ange and his agent being the recruitment wing of Celtic during his tenure. That to me fits with the pattern going into this, which is Ange came into this situation, basically saw what was at his disposal in the club as far as deciding what players to bring in. It went the other direction, meaning that basically him and his agent sourced a bunch of players that they knew about. And where does that leave us? Like this is what Alan and I have talked about for basically 2 seasons, which is, rue the day when he departs, because it seems like basically a one-man operation, relative to his agent as well, to some degree. And you know, that's all speculation. Like maybe you know, the football operations people were bringing stuff to his attention, and for whatever reason, you know, he didn't like it, or what wasn't fond of the direction that those people were going. Who knows? But given the historical pattern, um, you know, this is going to be a big proving ground, so to speak. And that's where I think that the names that are being raised are very interesting, and we'll get into that. But you know, when people talk about the board, um, you know, I think that there's, as we saw with the hiring process last time, there seems to be various power centers in the board, shall we say, and maybe philosophical differences, with a with the patriarch sitting on top, and ultimately he's the one that's going to probably make the decision. And it depends on whether or not he can be persuaded to go a certain direction, or whether he asserts his power and kind of pushes something through. That's kind of how I read things. So we're left with, trying to predict what Dermot Desmond's decision-making process is going to be.
So I just want to turn into a tabloid publication here for just 1 minute. So
Yes.
Before I move on to the names, I just want to say that Tottenham are clearly a tiny club with zero resources, and there's no reason why Ange should have chosen Spurs over Celtic. So just want to get that off the chest while we're acting as a tabloid publication. Next up on our agenda is who is going to be the next Celtic manager. So the names are, this is the current odds, by the way. There are obviously more names in line than this, but names are Brendan Rodgers is still favorite for the job, even though there are no new links, barring what he said in an interview a couple of years ago. There seems to be nothing new on the story that Brendan Rodgers is going to be the new Celtic manager. Another name that I'm going to try not to butcher, because it's honestly the first time that I've seen the name, and that is Kjetil Knutsen, who is a Norwegian coach. He is the Bodo Glimt manager. And then third on the list is Enzo Maresca, also previously linked with the Celtic job. Des Buckingham, in the last couple of hours, has jumped up from about 30-1 earlier on to just over 5-1. And then David Moyes, Kevin Muscat, John Kennedy, Jesse Marsh, etc., are well down the list. But Des Buckingham, this is an interesting one. This is one I want to focus on for just 1 second, because it ties in with the board. So, as we all know, Peter Lawwell left his role about a year and a half ago, or a year ago, and his son Mark Lawwell joined the club. Now, Mark is part of the he's the head of first team scouting and recruitment. That's his official title with Celtic. But he was part of the City Group, as was Ange when he managed in Japan. And there seems to be this insinuation, Alan, that Celtic are a de facto City Group team. Now, the name Des Buckingham may not be well known to everybody here. He was not known at all to me before it became apparent on Twitter that he's going to be in the running, and he's been photographed in Scotland already. He is manager of Mumbai FC, who are part of the City Group, and doing well in the Indian Football League. So, Alan, are you hearing anything from the people that Celtic are, without naming them as a City Group club, are part of the City Group, or trying to adopt a City Group model where they're eyeing up talent that are part of the clubs around the world, like Ange was, and Des Buckingham could actually be a potential name here? Or where do you see the whole idea of Celtic being part of the City Group and what that means for them going forward, and Mark Lawwell and the board?
I mean, well, Celtic aren't part of the City Group in any formal way, but informally, it seems like there's a close connection. There's clearly, a familial connection, as was between the Law family. Mark Law came from Man City as one of their global heads of recruitment, and moved to Celtic. And Peter Law therefore has relationships and with that, as did Ange when he was manager at Yokohama, who are part of the City Group. And it does seem that all the names you mentioned really fall into two broad categories. One is Dermot Desmond's Rolodex of British and Irish football people, and the other is, people connected to the City group. So that does seem to be the boundaries around which, within which Celtic seem to be operating at the moment. Now, hopefully, maybe there will be some left field people that don't operate within those boundaries. That might be a good thing. It might not. I don't know. But that does seem to be the general sort of feeling. I mean, Celtic do seem to be, like you say, an unofficial, non-economic extension of the City Group to some extent. Now that has its advantages. The City Group's incredibly successful as an operation in terms of, setting up football clubs, forming partnerships, sharing knowledge, sharing best practice, being a proving ground for a consistent set of coaching principles and culture to breed young players, young coaches, etc. So there are clearly benefits to that. The name of I think it's Des Buckingham, who's been a very successful coach at youth level with New Zealand and with teams in Australia, and now with Mumbai City. But before that, with another Indian club. But again, all within the sort of City Group framework. Something that popped up on one of my WhatsApps was the idea that he would then form a partnership with Maresca, who's one of Guardiola's assistants. Rodolfo Borrell has popped up on Twitter quite a bit. He's another one of Guardiola's assistants. All these things are very interesting. I'm very skeptical. I come back to what is it that we need, right? And for me, what we need to focus on is one fundamental fact, which is that if you win the Scottish Premier League next season, you get direct entry into the Champions League. And that is all that we should have in our mind. That is the target. I don't care about the cups, particularly. I hope we make a good fist of it in Europe, but we absolutely have to win the league next season because we get direct entry into the Champions League group stages. And it's the only surefire way of financially transforming a club like Celtic is to continue to be in that environment that would then make it 3 seasons in a row. So recruitment, and I'm sorry if I'm sounding a bit short-termism, and it might not be what people expect from what I've said in the past, but we should absolutely be focused on winning that league next season above everything else.
So hire Brendan Rodgers?
Well, to me, that would be the least. I don't even know if he's available in terms of. I know he's available. He's not got a job.
Yeah.
I don't even know if he's interested. No idea. But in terms of the names that you've just mentioned, he would be my number one pick because he would be the safest option to get to that goal, and probably actually the season after, because it's likely the season after we'll get guaranteed Champions League football. Brendan Rodgers, whatever you might putting everything else to one side for one moment, you know, he he succeeded at Liverpool till he didn't, and that was I think in his fourth season. He succeeded at he never lost a trophy at Celtic. He's arguably Leicester City's most successful manager of all time, right? When he was there,
Mhm.
and I know Ranieri won the Premier League, but I think they were 14th the year before and the 12th or 11th the year after. Rodgers took them within 2 or 3 points of the Champions League on 2 consecutive seasons, and then they finished eighth. And then again, it all fell apart in the fourth season. But you've got to remember that every season that he was at Leicester, they were selling their best players, and he was having to buy lesser players, right? So to me, Brendan Rodgers is a top coach, and he would be to me to meet the short term objectives over the next 2 years, which would help to grow the club to an enormous degree. He would be the obvious. He's the most obvious candidate. I have no idea whether we're interested in him. No idea whether he's interested in
Yeah.
Celtic. I would be astonished if that were the case, to be honest with you. But to me, that's the most
Well,
sensible choice.
well, let's tease this out a bit then, James, because for me, I hate the idea of Brendan Rodgers because not because of anything to do with his coaching. Actually, I agree with everything that Alan has said there. I think he's a brilliant manager who has a track record at every club that he's been at. But unfortunately, he also does have a track record at every club that he's been at of leaving the club in disarray, having brought in players who do not sell on very well, end up with a bulky squad that you can't sell on like he did at Celtic, did the exact same at Leicester, Liverpool to a lesser degree because he didn't get a chance, but still did it slightly at Liverpool as well. But is there an argument to be made that Celtic actually do need to plan short term? Because now, if you look at it, Brendan Rodgers left for Leicester after 2.5 years. Ange has left after 2 years. Celtic is a stepping stone club for players. Should Celtic now act as if their club is almost, in many cases, a stepping stone for a manager, get someone in who's trying to either improve his managerial CV like Ange, or to rebuild his managerial CV like Brendan Rodgers, and just go for a 2-year person who's going to come in, do the job for 2 years, continue the success at the level. Don't mess with the transfer system too much. Still keep the player trading model, but plan for 2 years in many ways. Don't plan for a dynasty, because I think that's the trap that Celtic almost fell into with Ange, is that it felt like it was going to become a dynasty, and now he's gone after 2 years.
Yeah, so this comes back to the same thing I've said since we started the show, which is that the model that Celtic needs to figure out is how to pipeline the ability to source talent on a consistent basis, and to do it in alignment with their peer group at the European level. And any reasonable benchmarking for that, it's been a failure. So the academy is in shambles, I would say. I mean, you just look at what's happened in the last 3 or 4 years relative to the departures and a lack of a coherent progression of players. I mean, they're trying to scramble, and some of that's not their fault because of the requirements in Scotland, that kind of thing. It's I'm not saying it's easy, but what I'm saying is, whether you try to look for different models at clubs that are doing it well, whether it's an Ajax, whether it's a Benfica, whether it's a Bodo Glimt, whether it's a Brighton, there's different models to accomplish it. And the manager as God model is not that. There is no contemporary model to do that consistently over the long term, where you're empowering an individual who's very likely only to be there for a couple of years, maybe 3. So this is the deal with the devil that we made with Ange, was that we basically made him the god, and now he is left, and we're stuck back where we were 2 years ago. So without coming up with and again, maybe that's what Lawwell was brought in. Mark Lawwell was brought in. Maybe he's that person. Maybe he's the visionary that's going to put forth some kind of dynamic, Celtic centric model, meaning that we're not just trying to mimic Man City, or we're not mimicking Salzburg. We need to come up with a unique, framework that capitalizes upon the inherent strengths of Celtic while managing the inherent weaknesses, and figure it out. And that's, I don't think, I'm fine with Brendan Rodgers. I'm fine with really any of these people as head coaches, within a range, but there's a big but here. Like, they need the players, and that's, how are we getting the talent in the door in order to facilitate not only winning the league next year, but progressing in Europe. And that's going to be, and this is why I've been harping on this idea that the recruitment under Ange was not that good. And that was reflected in the issues that we've had in Europe the last 2 seasons. So, how do we go back to that kind of fundamental issue and improve the talent that we're bringing in? Because that facilitates the player trading model, obviously. And that's the real issue now, is that, it's in the news. Matt O'Reilly, Kyogo, like our best players, Jota, like those 3 people, Abada's probably going. Like, that creates a lot of resources probably. So we're going to be flush with cash in order to allocate it in a smart way. Who do we trust to be doing that? Like, what, maybe Mark Lawwell's the guy. I don't know. But, where's the evidence of that in his tenure so far? And it's such a Borg environment at Man City, meaning that there is no individual person. That's a structure of a lot of smart people that Celtic doesn't have. So are we tapping into that somehow indirectly to get, the intellectual firepower of some of those people to identify talent? Who knows, but I haven't seen any evidence of it yet. So we can hope, but I don't think Rogers or Maresca or Jesse Marsh or even Knutson, I'll try it myself, from Bodo Glimt. I don't think any of those people necessarily address that problem.
Well, that's the key reason why I have my biggest concerns about Rogers is that whatever about Ange leaving, I don't necessarily agree that we're in the same place as we were 2 years ago, because we didn't have the Kyogo, Jota, Abada, Matt O'Reilly products to sell. We literally had just a full bloated squad of older players who had no value. I think Frimpong was the only player that we had that we sold for anything worthwhile, and that was for probably 5 to 10 million less than we probably should have gotten for him. I think the squad's in a much better place, but that's why I don't think it's a Rodgers type that Celtic need, because you need the manager to be replaceable. You need the model that I think that's kind of what you're saying as well, is that the manager should always be replaceable. The squad should always continue to evolve regardless of who the manager is. It's sort of like what Brighton are doing. Brighton have just agreed this morning that Alexis McAllister, a World Cup winning midfielder, is going to Liverpool. You can almost guarantee they're going to have a midfielder that's going to be suited to that squad, already signed and scouted and ready to go. And even if De Zerbi left in the morning, it would be the exact same player that they wanted in the midfield to replace Alexis McAllister, regardless of who that manager is. That's the system that Celtic need. And I know it's much, much harder to do it at Scottish level. You're probably not getting perfect suits, but the manager should always be replaceable. The players should always be the same type of players, regardless of who the manager is. So, Alan, I mean, that's a pretty tough task. And given the history that Celtic have, I don't think they're ready for that. I don't. It's such a difficult decision to whether you either go full blown into that model and take the risks with a Des Buckingham or whoever it is, or you go back to a Brendan Rodgers.
Let me just. I have to say.
I hope it's not.
I hope it's not Des Buckingham, because I'm going to be laughing at his name for the entirety of his tenure.
But essentially, what I'm saying is that we should. You can't go half-hearted into this.
No, you can, and you can't then therefore not have the structures that you've talked about. So, because Celtic are so behind the times in terms of their football operations, a manager like Ange Postecoglou makes perfect sense, because he mitigates the fact that your football operations are not modern, that you don't have all this, advanced, scouting, advanced youth development, advanced analysis, etc. Always being, you always got a list of people to replace the manager. You've got consistency running through the organization. If you don't have that, then a manager like Ange comes in, can be incredibly successful, and he was. Now that Ange has left, what it does really is illustrate the threadbare nature of the talent that's in the organisation from a football operations perspective at Celtic. So bringing in a Des Buckingham or a Enzo Maresco or a Rodolfo Borrell, who've never, managed a professional football team in their lives at this level, isn't going to be the answer, right? This is what I'm saying. Until you don't build that football infrastructure, you might as well get the best manager in that's going to get us over the line to win the freaking league and get into the Champions League, because that's such a big prize, and it's such a big prize, A, to give to your rival, but B, to help grow the football club. But whilst you're doing that, you need to be modernising the football club at the same time, is the unsaid thing that I should have said as well. But there's no point giving it.
But I think that's the question, though, Alan, isn't it? Though, can you actually
until we've got that infrastructure?
But sorry, Alan, to cut across you, but can you do that while you bring in a manager? Let's just say it is Brendan Rodgers, because that's the easiest thing to do. A manager like Brendan Rodgers comes in. He did the exact same at Leicester, who had a good scouting system. He comes in. He wants his players. He demands his players. He brings in his players. Can you build the football infrastructure and operations, and also hire a manager who wants full control? Because that's the thing that Celtic are going to be battling with here.
Well, as I say, this is the square that this circle that has to be squared. We have to win the league next season. I come back to it. I don't care what this is where we are today, right? Short term, we have to win the league next season. That's, to me, that's non-negotiable, right? In the meantime, we also have to build a modern football organization. I'm saying that, right? I'm expecting the board to be on board with the first objective. I've no idea if they're on board with the second objective, and that's the issue, right? And I can't influence that, obviously, and we can't influence that easily. So, to my mind, at least get the first objective, um, achieved, because then what you do is what is already. James and I have talked about this. Celtic have got today, um, in the context of Scottish football, and this will be discussed on the upcoming pod with Kieran Maguire. In Scottish terms, a significant financial advantage over every other club in Scotland, but it isn't enough to guarantee that we'll win the league, because the current quality of the rest of the SPFL is so low that a Rangers side that is well behind Celtic financially is only two wins and a draw away from topping Celtic in the league. That's the margin, because the rest of Scottish football is so poor. Okay, but if we can get Champions League football for the next 2 years, even our board must realise that gives them the breathing space to then take some risks with building a modern football structure, and maybe getting that young up and coming dynamic coaching team in, who are effectively fungible in terms of the football operation continues in a consistent way, and the managers come and go. I think Paul Brennan actually said it brilliantly today. At the moment, the manager is the spanner. We need the manager to become the cog, right? And the football club operation turns around, and he's not the one that's cranking the wheel. That's where we need to get to. We'll put all of that in jeopardy if we don't take that Champions League bounty for the next 2 seasons. So in lieu of having that mature football operations, my view is we just simply have to get that over the line. And I know that's not the right answer. It's not the answer I want to give you, but that's the way I
Yeah.
see it today.
We've gone through two managers now in the space of our Huddle Breakdown history as a podcast. Neil Lennon first, and then Ange Postecoglou. James, it's been two different various styles and management styles and personalities, and I know which one I personally enjoyed more. But what do you think is the best one to go for style wise, forgetting about philosophies or overarching recruitment levels for the squad that we currently have to make progress in the Champions League and to win the league? What style of manager do you think Celtic need?
Well, I think that's the one of the most difficult aspects of this transition, is that Ange is obviously during his tenure at Celtic, um, a cult of personality, and I mean that in a largely positive way. I mean that he's such a big character, that it's a difficult show, so to speak, to follow. I mean, it's like a stand-up comic that has an opener that's tears the house down, puts blows the roof off of the theater, and then how do you follow that up? And so I think it's I think it's unreasonable to expect whoever they hire to be able to come in and fill that void, with the support in particular, in almost the like a blind faith buy-in, because of the leadership and the character and the persona that Ange had. Um, and that's I think that's why it's really difficult. I mean, he was despite the kind of chaos that he walked into and the initial, like, who's this guy, he was able to get the support on board, even though the first month to 8 weeks was a bit of a mess, quite frankly. And you didn't hear the knives being out, so to speak, with any significance during that period. And I think that was a testimony to him and his talent in that regard. Whoever they hire, if they get off to a rough patch in the first 4 to 8 weeks, I don't think they're going to get that kind of level of forgiveness or patience out of the support. And that's even within, ignoring the context of what's going on, like society and culturally, and how people's daily lives are really stressed out right now. I mean, this, you know, so again, I think the power of Ange cannot be underestimated. And I'm not talking about like mystical, crazy stuff. I'm just saying, how he was able to rally and get a community of people together to buy in behind him and to sell that message. And again, that's the dual-edged sword. I think that's why there's such an emotional response to him leaving, is because he was so effective at doing that. It's just it's not likely to happen. Let's say, this, the guy with the porn star name, what's his name? Buckingham. That's his first name?
As Buckingham.
Yeah. Des Buckingham comes in. What are the chances that I looked at his date of birth, like he's 10 years younger than me. It's driving me nuts. Right. So he's going to come in with this kind of job, or even Maresca he's in his early 40s. Neither of these guys have been tested at any kind of reasonable pressure cooker level. That for him to come into Glasgow at Celtic in isolation would be a huge ask. Then to do it following up on Ange in the middle of a cost of living crisis where the UK economy is in the toilet, where people's, when food bank utilization is off the charts, like this is like a crazy job that somebody's going to be coming into as far as challenge comes. And, so there's a lot of externalities here that it's just going to be a really tough, they almost have to hit the ground running. And then again, we're back to this issue where material parts of the squad may be leaving, understandably. And quite frankly, I would argue they should be within a reasonable player trading model, that kind of 2 to 3 season timeline. That's when they should be moving on. So again, this is such a huge ask for the board. And it's a board, again, that has not displayed, an ability to do this with any consistency. And that's where I agree. I agree with Alan to a degree about Brendan Rodgers. Like the problem with Rodgers is he's got the baggage of the way he left. Right, he would be the kind of person that would come in. That's not Jesse Marsh. Like I don't know who knows that's not Jesse Marsh either. Like no. That's not Graham Potter.
If only there was somebody who had a history of following a manager, taking his players, and then winning. Oh, there is Kevin Muscat. He's done it twice. He literally followed Ange Postecoglou into 2 jobs at Melbourne Victory and at Yokohama today, his current role, which, as we all know, is a demanding job in a demanding league. And he's taken Ange Postecoglou players and he's evolved the squad to be successful and to win titles on the back of that. So, I mean, to me, after Brendan Rodgers, that would be an eminently sensible step to take, and it also ticks it ticks the Citigroup box as well. So those to me are the absolutely obvious, scream out loud, solutions to the current predicament. Because to me, if Enzo Maresca, I'm picking on the guy, I don't really know a lot about him, but if you were Dermot Desmond, if you were recruiting senior people in any other business, you'd be looking at him saying, "You've applied for this job, so you're 45 years old. You've never coached a football team in your life. Why are you applying for Celtic? Why don't you fuck off and coach Fleetwood Athletic or Burton Albion for a couple of years and learn your bloody trade? Why are you here? Right? That's what that would be my challenge. That would literally be my challenge to Enzo Maresca, etc. Graham Potter is failed at the first big club that he went to. He's a brilliant coach of small teams with limited expectations. He's done absolutely fantastic. Can he handle Celtic? Well, the evidence at Chelsea was no, he couldn't. Now he might be able to. I don't know. Right? It could be the sort of redemption story he needs. Jesse March, he was successful in a dominant Salzburg team in Austria, but he absolutely failed miserably at Leeds. He pissed everybody off. He pissed the players off, the supporters, the board. He played horrible, chaotic football. What is in there that makes you think this is going to be a great Celtic manager? Our friend Kjetil Knutsen, right? He's 52 years old. He's won 2 Norwegian titles, and I think 3 years ago had an amazing run to the semi-finals of the Europa League, maybe when they hammered Mourinho's Roma, right? And they hammered Celtic. If I was a senior recruiter and I've got this guy in front of me, I'm saying to him, "You've had all this success. You're 52 years old. Why are you still there? Why didn't you bugger off 2 years ago and get a job in Holland or Germany, a reasonably sized club, and really, where's your drive, man? Where's your ambition? That's what Ange had, right? So none of the options in front of us are good ones. The only two that I can see that make complete sense to me to meet the short-term objectives and give the board space to sort the bloody club out are Rodgers and Muscat.
I swear to God, I thought you were going to say Neil Lennon there.
Well, give me
I
another 5
genuinely
minutes.
thought you were going to say Neil Lennon there.
Well,
Yeah,
so
look,
go ahead, Enda.
they're all really good points. Like the one counterpoint that I would make to your point, Alan, is that Ange was what 56 or 55 when he took over Celtic and hadn't managed in Europe. So I know he had managed
But
Australia at the World
Yokohama's
Cup
a big
and
club,
he
I
had
would
won.
argue.
And
He
that's
managed the
fine,
national
but
team.
yeah,
He's left every
and
job
that's fine. But
to
the
better
question
himself.
was,
Every job. Yeah.
the question was, he's 55. Why hasn't he got a big job yet? And he just never got the opportunity. So like, I'm not saying that Maresca is the same, because it's not. But you can also make the debate that Mikel Arteta, if he wasn't a professional football player, what had he done as a coach to deserve the Arsenal job? And he's done a fantastic job. Just because you haven't done the big job doesn't mean you're not capable of the big job. But I get the idea that you're putting across in terms of risk, that to get the short-term success Celtic need, that they probably shouldn't be risking it on a Maresca or whoever else.
Sorry, James. Under the
Yeah.
sort of informal relationship with the City group, we got a genuinely world-class manager in Postecoglou. If the next offering is essentially a work experience assistant manager, that is some climb down. That is some climb down.
Yeah, and I actually I had mentioned this on a couple of prior occasions that Muscat was kind of an obvious potential candidate. The fact that he played, I think it was 29 appearances at Rangers 20 years ago, is maybe
Who
would.
cares? Who cares?
Well, I don't care, but some people, I've already seen it, like on Twitter, like there's an element of the support that's going to care about that. And again, that comes back to this issue of walking in behind Ange and then having that kind of baggage. A normal transition here, because of the potential for turnover in the squad, I would agree he would ameliorate that to a degree, because he would be playing presumably a very similar style of play. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I think he would ameliorate that. But again, this comes back to the vision issue, which is playing Ange ball the way that we should be going relative to competing in Europe? And I think that's a huge question, because I agree.
That's a question, yeah.
Right. So that's the strategic aspect of this. So Muscat to me makes complete sense, all in, if we're going to play that way. Should we be playing that way? So that's where you get back to a guy like Knutson, where he's kind of got a little bit of a different way of going about it, very similar, but he's shown the ability to adjust in a way at that level that, quite frankly, Ange hasn't. But the issue there comes back to, what's the attribution? Like, why has Bodo Glimt been so good? And it's because of what they've been able to do with their youth system and their development of players,
and the culture
of their academy.
Yeah.
Right.
Also helps that they play in the Arctic Circle.
Well, right, to a degree, on the margins, absolutely.
In Europe, yeah.
Right, but how is that guy going to walk in? And I don't know anything about him other than I read this week that his assistant, I guess, his number 2 is like vitally important to him. So are those guys going to plop down at Celtic and all of a sudden completely overhaul the academy system that's in an environment that's different than Norway, with the entrenched powers of people that have been at Celtic for years and years and years? I'm skeptical, maybe. So is his, what's driven his success, is that replicable at Celtic, because again, it's about sourcing talent and players. And that's the one thing with all these guys at the City Group is that, Maresca went to Parma. Tough top, I'm not judging him on 14 games or whatever it was, but he didn't have the pipeline of talent coming in. This guy at Mumbai, he's getting the talent like that. Ange, he got talent. So come into Yokohama. And again, that's Muscat has basically picked up the baton from Ange and done pretty much the same thing. I mean, I think he won the league last season with a much lower wage bill than Vassell. So, again, it comes back to how do you source talent and do it over a long period of time.
Is the Bodo Glimt assistant manager the Michael Beale of Norwegian football? Is that what you're saying?
Yes. The mastermind. Yes. Or maybe more timely, the fact that it looks like we might be losing John Kennedy, which again, if you talk about institutional DNA and culture and memory, again, I don't know John. I have no idea the inner workings, but from what I've heard, and Brendan Rodgers and Ange both seem to think very highly of the guy. It's what I've heard. He's a really bright individual. He's a really smart person within the context of football. So, there's another vacuum. Not only will it be Ange gone, if John Kennedy leaves, where's that center of, institutional memory? And, that's a huge challenge.
Bring back Damien Duff. That's what I say. He's got first team experience at this point.
Maybe Liam Scales should retire and become a coach.
Oh God! Right. We're gonna have plenty of time to discuss this because it doesn't look like Celtic are going to have a manager in the next week or so. Hopefully, it's not in the next few hours before I get this podcast out and up on YouTube because we'll look like fools otherwise. But I highly doubt that as well.
Bigger fools, Enda.
Well, that's true. You can't make a fool look a fool. So that's where we'll park the conversation for this week. Hopefully, we will get the Kieran Maguire interview out to you next week as the podcast. Should Celtic not appoint a manager before then? If they do, and if it's in a reasonable period, and if it suits our schedules, we will put both of them episodes out because I don't want to sit on the Kieran Maguire interview for too much longer. So that will be next week's podcast. And if Celtic appoint a manager between now and then, we will try and record another podcast and have a look at that. Well, it could be Des Buckingham. Who knows? Because he's in Glasgow already. Alan, you wanna say a final point?
Are we wrapping up the show without an in-depth discussion on that wonderful display on Saturday? Sorry.
I'll give you 10 seconds to do a deep dive on the Inverness one. Right, guys. Thanks very much.
No comment.
Yeah.
Take care.
Bye.